flags proudly floating on the land and on the main. Shout, shout, battle cry of freedom. Beneath it oft we've conquered and will conquer oft again. Shout, shout, the battle cry of freedom. Our deep sea forever, she's never had a loss. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode. We are here at Chapter 14. We have been building up to this election, this moment, this chapter for a while now. So, without further ado, let's talk about the famous election here of 1860. We have three major candidates. We all know the first candidate is Abraham Lincoln. We've been slowly introducing him and his beliefs. We've really said that he is going to be the Republican candidate. We've said that he has beliefs that are rooted in the Free Soil Party, which, remember, the Free Soilers are going to also make up the Republican Party. And the Free Soilers, okay, remember their platform. They are all about to, not extend slavery into those Western territories. What else does Lincoln support and encourage? What else does he want to see? He wants to see a protective tariff. Remember, the northern manufacturers usually favor that. The southerners don't like tariffs because, again, the South doesn't have industry. And being they don't have industry, they usually have to import a lot of goods, and tariffs will affect them more than the North. Lincoln also supports a transcontinental railroad connecting the North to the West. He also supports free homesteads, and the homesteads means land. We will talk about in a future chapter the Homestead Act, which gives free land to people out in the West. So the Northerners are certainly going to like Lincoln, and also the Westerners, okay? Because if you look at his policies, they're pro-West and pro-North. Now, as far as the South, there's two major candidates, and the first guy is Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas is, although a Northerner, he is really going to have ideals that are supported by the Southerners. What does he support? He supports popular sovereignty. Remember, he came up with that Kansas-Nebraska Act to get his transcontinental railroad, and he allowed Kansas-Nebraska territories popular sovereignty. Remember, popular sovereignty, very important term. It means let the people decide in those territories, let them vote on whether or not they will become slave or free states. He also supports the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, okay, which again is something that a lot of Northerners do not like. So, although he's a Northerner, he's a Northern Democrat, he is not going to be very popular amongst his northern states. The other guy is at the bottom there, John C. Breckinridge. He is going to be all about slavery, okay? He is all about expanding slavery into the territories and also trying to annex Cuba, okay, the Ostend Manifesto. So, Lincoln, as we know, is going to win the election. You see the results here, and the Electoral College results, and all those purple states, okay, are going to vote for Lincoln. What's crazy is Lincoln is what we call a minority president, meaning only really a couple of sections of the country voted for him. But those sections of the country were the valuable ones, okay? The North that have a lot of electoral votes, the South does not. And the South didn't even put him on the ballot in 10 states down there. So they're really upset. They are going to deem this a very unfair election, and they're basically going to say, hey, listen, what's the purpose of us even being part of this country if our votes don't even matter? Whoever the North votes for is going to be president. Who cares about what we have to say? So the South is not happy. South Carolina is going to be the first state to secede or leave the Union because of this. They don't like Lincoln. They don't like what he represents, and they believe that he is going to abolish slavery. However, remember, he's a free soiler. So South Carolina secedes from the Union. 7 other states will follow their lead, and they form the Confederacy, and they elect a president in the name of Jefferson Davis. Now, although Lincoln's been elected, he's not president just yet, right? He is a president-elect, sorry. Lame duck President James Buchanan, he's still president, and they ask him, hey, listen, what are you going to do about South Carolina seceding from the Union? Buchanan says, listen, not my problem, okay? President-elect Lincoln is going to have to deal with that, so thank you very much, Buchanan. They try one last effort to try and prevent this conflict which is about to happen, and they call it the Crittenden Compromise.
What they propose is, why don't they bring back the Missouri Compromise idea of 3630 line, where everything above it will be free and everything below it will be slave. Lincoln rejects this. He says, no, it's not happening. Why? Because you're possibly allowing slavery to still expand, even though it's below 3630. He doesn't want that. Okay, the Republicans, the Free Soilers are all about no extension of slavery. Well, the real reason this fails, Henry Clay has already died, but that's just a side note. So before Lincoln has even taken office, 7 southern states have seceded the Union, and he's got a huge conflict. Things go down after he is inaugurated very shortly in a place called Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter on the map there, this little federal fort is obviously pro-Union. They're a federal territory, if you will, and they are surrounded by the enemy, the Confederacy. They're in Carolina. And the guys in Fort Sumter, they hit up Lincoln. They say, listen, Lincoln, things are getting bad for us. We're running out of food, medicine. We're surrounded by the enemy. Can you help us out? Can you send us some food and medicine? Lincoln says, sure, I got you. Before I just do that, though, let me give Jefferson Davis a heads up and tell him. Jefferson Davis gets the message and he says to Lincoln, absolutely not. I am not allowing that. And before Lincoln can even try to come up with a counter offer, if you will, or a solution, Fort Sumter is attacked by the Confederacy. They will fall, and the first shots of the Civil War have now occurred. So Lincoln has some priorities, okay? He has some things that he has to do in order to make sure the North is successful. One of his biggest priorities is holding on to the border states. Lincoln has already lost 7 southern states to the Confederacy before he was inaugurated. Another 4 joined the Confederacy after his inauguration. Then these orange states right here, they are called the border states, okay? The 5 border states there. He cannot lose them, okay? They're very, very important for various reasons. The biggest reason, okay, is that if he loses these 5 states, he loses industrial capacity. The South would double their industrial capacity if they were to gain these orange 5 states right here, the border states. Other things, he would lose men, okay, in order to fight, right? Part of the army. He would also lose Maryland, which is very important geographically speaking because Washington, D.C., okay, is in Maryland, and so losing the capital would pretty much mean losing the war. Not good. So the border states are very, very important. What is Lincoln's goal? Hold on to the border states and preserve the Union, okay? Nothing to do with slavery there, okay? He's not looking to abolish slavery once the Civil War begins. All right, so we talked about most of this already. We talked about the advantages, okay, of having those border states. Now, at the bottom here, there's a big theme here having to do with presidents during times of war. So here's our first major example. Lincoln in the Civil War is very similar to Woodrow Wilson in World War I, FDR in World War II, and both Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon in Vietnam War. Is that during those times of war, the presidents and the federal government, their power tends to increase, and the civil liberties of citizens, a regular citizen, decreases. Okay, so that's a trend amongst all those presidents during all those wars. So make sure you know that. So what does Lincoln do to increase his power? So he does a few things. Besides increasing the size of the Navy without congressional approval, without ordering a blockade with Congress's approval. He also does things like declaring martial law in Maryland. Now, Maryland, remember, has Washington, D.C. Martial law, if you know what that is, it means bringing in the military to essentially put the city, and in this case, the state on lockdown. Okay, no one's allowed in or out. There's curfews, and it's a military state essentially. Okay, for the time being. The other thing he does was suspend habeas corpus, which means Habeas corpus is your right to due process, they call it. This means you're allowed to have a fair trial, a jury by your peers, you're entitled to a lawyer, you are being told why you're being arrested. If you go to jail, you have to be told why you're going to jail. Those are all things part of habeas corpus, your amendments 5 through 8. He suspends that. He throws people in jail without telling them, which is, is it abuse of power? You can argue that, but could you also argue that it was necessary for national security? Sure. Okay, totally up to you. I'm not going to tell you which one you should argue. Advantages and disadvantages for the North and the South. What does the North have? They have industry, makes sense. They have the railroad. That's good for transporting goods and also soldiers. They have the Navy, they have the government. They have the population advantage, 22 million to 9 million, and they also don't have slavery. So on paper, the advantages are numerous, okay? But the biggest disadvantage for the North, for the Union, is their lack of leadership. You may say, wait, what? Don't they have Lincoln? Isn't he a great leader? Yes, but he's not a military leader. What they lack is a Robert E. Lee, okay? And Lincoln actually calls up Robert E. Lee and he says, listen, can you lead the Northern Army? Uh, Robert E. Lee says, I'd love to. However, I don't believe in the federal supremacy. He believes in states' rights. And he says, listen, my home state of Virginia is where my loyalty lies. And if Virginia goes to the Confederacy, then I will fight for them. And as we know, Virginia is part of the Confederacy. So he does turn down Lincoln and fights for the Confederacy. The North also doesn't have a purpose, okay? Their lack of purpose hurts them because remember, what are you fighting for? You're fighting to preserve the Union. It's a very abstract idea, okay? Whereas the South, they do have a purpose. They're fighting for independence. They're fighting for their way of life of slavery, which dominates their social, economic, and political life. So besides their purpose, they are fighting a defensive war, right? Home field advantage. They have the Robert E. Lees of the war. They also have something called cotton diplomacy. Cotton diplomacy means that they were trying to use cotton as a bargaining chip to lure Europe into the war. They were trying to say, hey, listen, England and France, you should join this war, help out the Confederacy if you want to still get cotton from us. They were very close to getting Europe to get involved, but we'll talk about why it is they don't get involved. Disadvantages, they don't have a navy, they don't have the government structure, they barely have enough equipment and food, they don't have the railroad system, they have a very weak economy with no currency and no manufacturing. So it's very surprising that the Confederacy was even able to go on this long without giving in or submitting to the North. Now, mobilizing for war, Lincoln is going to pass the Conscription Act, which is just a fancy way of saying the draft. Men 20 to 45 will be drafted into the war. Thing was, though, if you had money, if you had $300, you were able to get out of the war and pay for a replacement. In the South, you also were able to do the same thing, but not with money, but with slaves. All right, if you had X amount of slaves, you could basically buy a substitute. A lot of riots you're going to see as well. A lot of racial tension in the North, specifically in New York City. You're going to see Irish immigrants attack African Americans, freed African Americans, because they are blaming them for the war, and also because of the lack of jobs in those northern cities. Okay, so be clear about Lincoln's priorities here. He's not fighting to end slavery. The Civil War is not necessarily about slavery. Will it become about slavery? Yes, but not at the beginning. He never acknowledged the Confederacy. He never acknowledged secession was legal. So he never actually acknowledges any of those southern states who have left the Union. Um, we talked about his importance of keeping the border states. We talked about the workers in the North and the racial tension. Lincoln's got a lot on his plate, and amongst that, he's not only got pushback amongst Northern Democrats for the war, he's also got pushback amongst his own political party, the Republicans. Now, the Republicans that are kind of pushing for Lincoln to do even more than he is are called the Radical Republicans. These guys in the slide right here, Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stephen, Benjamin Wade, they're going to push Lincoln to want more change. and you may recognize one of those guys there, Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner is the guy that was beat up by Preston Brooks in that beatdown after the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas that we talked about last chapter. So why? What do these guys want? What kind of change do they want to push for? They really want to push for the 13th Amendment. They want emancipation for all slaves. Why? Well, ideological, it's the right thing to do, okay, right? There shouldn't be slavery. Now, the military aspect of it is if you free the slaves, you can have them help fight for the Union, and you undermine the entire process of the South and what they're fighting for. So this could be a huge thing. But obviously, the Civil War in the beginning is not about slavery, so they're not going to get the support from Lincoln just yet. So in the beginning of the war, in August 1861, you have something called the Confiscation Act. This said slaves were, if they were used for insurrectionary purposes, which basically means if they're being used for labor to help out the Confederacy, they're free. They just have to make it to a Union camp. You're not going to see many slaves want to flee their plantation because of this. About a year later, the Second Confiscation Act says all slaves are free if they are enslaved by somebody who is engaged in a rebellion. Okay, so if your master is openly part of the Confederacy, you're technically free. Again, not too many slaves are going to flee their plantation to go, hide out in a Union camp and be free. They're not going to make it. They're scared of those stricter slave codes. Ultimately, about a year later, about 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation is passed after the North gets a huge victory, the Battle of Antietam, and Lincoln decides he's going to emancipate the slaves. Now, here's what we have to be careful of. The Emancipation Proclamation does not free all of the slaves. Okay, so in elementary school, middle school, you may have learned or may remember the Emancipation Proclamation you talked about end slavery. It's not true. Okay, who does it free? It frees slaves in the Confederacy, in rebellious states. It does not free slaves in those border states. Those border states had slaves in them. So those slaves were not free. Okay, only slaves in rebellious states. Now, by doing this, okay, what you're doing is you are now making the Civil War also about slavery. Okay, this becomes an important advantage for the North that they needed. It completely knocks out the possibility of Europe getting involved because they had already outlawed slavery, so why would they join the Confederacy who supports slavery? You're giving the Union possible more soldiers, and it's going to pave the way for that 13th Amendment, which we'll talk about next chapter. All right. The problem is, although this sounds really great, this all sounds really great, technically Lincoln does not have control of the Confederacy, so, you're relying upon slaves to kind of take it upon themselves. So like I said before, run away. All right, and again, doesn't apply to border states. Now, speaking of those African Americans that were going to join the Union Army now, you're going to see a bunch of former slaves and also freed African Americans in the North join the Union Army in what's called the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. They are going to join the bunch of these all-black units. This was just one famous one in particular. They made a movie about it, Glory. Okay, very good movie. Check it out if you haven't you've ever seen it before. Poor Dred Scott. Too bad he wasn't around for this. And Frederick Douglass, remember him, the abolitionist, the guy who was born a slave. He's going to be very vocal about trying to enlist African Americans in the Union Army because he wants them to prove to these, politicians that they are worthy of citizenship, and later on the 15th Amendment, which is the right to vote. Okay, we talked about this earlier, how executive power and the federal government increases their power during times of war. Here are just some of the examples I mentioned before. Politics, okay, so for Lincoln, I mentioned before, he has a lot of issues not only amongst the Confederacy, but also within his own party. So Lincoln is going to receive pushback by radical Republicans, like we mentioned before. He's going to get pushback from those Northern Democrats because he's doing too little or too much. The Peace Democrats who oppose the war. This is all going to come to a head in an election in the middle of the Civil War. That's right, we have an election. Lincoln does beat his former general, General McClellan. So Lincoln's got a lot on his plate besides the war. He's got a lot of politics going on, a lot of people against him in his own party and also the Democrats as well. Challenges for the Confederacy. Cotton diplomacy does not pan out. Cotton, the bargaining chip of cotton doesn't work out, and Europe will not wind up getting involved. Antietam was the big battle in which this paved the way for Europe to not get involved, and also paved the way for the Emancipation Proclamation. States' rights made it very difficult for the South to be successful. For example, when a state in the South like Texas wanted troops or they needed troops for a battle, and they asked their neighboring states, Mississippi or Louisiana, they said no, we're not going to send our troops out of our state. They're only for our state only. So that's not going to work out. Just like states' rights didn't work out in the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so when I talked about before that, the North is going to pass a lot of legislation actually without the South being in Congress, because remember, the South, when they seceded from the Union, they pulled all the representatives from Washington, and so that's going to make it very easy for the North to pass through some laws. Some of these laws we'll talk about more in future chapters, like the Homestead Act I mentioned earlier, the Pacific Railway Act as well. These things, you don't necessarily have to know them right now, but we will talk more about them. And all I'm trying to get across here is the point that Congress was dominated by the Republicans during the Civil War, and it made it very easy for them to get through legislation that they supported without Southern Democrat, tension. Impact of the war. This is America's bloodiest war in our history. Over 600,000 lives are lost. Our bloodiest war by far. That includes the world wars. That includes Vietnam, for example. The South is absolutely destroyed. They literally have to be rebuilt after the war is over. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. Republican laws, okay, passed. We mentioned the Union is preserved. Secession and nullification from here on out are deemed impossible. You can't do it. Secession and nullification will never come up again as an issue. Civil War, all right, was the biggest test for our democracy yet. It seems to have survived. We'll have to see. But obviously, in retrospect, we kind of know that it does. 4 million slaves will be freed by the 13th Amendment. Okay, so what ends slavery? The 13th Amendment, not the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, we don't really talk about the battles here, but if you're ever interested, there is so much information out there about all the individual battles of the Civil War. You can spend an entire college class talking about the Civil War, which if you do, it's a really cool class. The surrender comes at Appomattox Courthouse. Robert E. Lee is finally outsmarted, which is actually very surprising, by Ulysses S. Grant, future president. Ulysses S. Grant comes on late during the war. He gets his name from a lot of battle victories in the Mississippi River. Basically, he's chosen by Lincoln to kind of take charge at the very end of the war. And somehow, some way, he outsmarts the almighty Robert E. Lee. Nonetheless, it happens, and Robert E. Lee will surrender to Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th, 1865. The Civil War is over. Unfortunately, though, Lincoln doesn't get to see Reconstruction. He is assassinated, our first president ever killed or assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, this guy who is an actor. Very sad story. You may know about it if your summer reading was, about, the manhunt for Lincoln's killer here. You know more about it. But essentially, the story is very simple. John Wilkes Booth was a Confederate sympathizer, very upset about the end of the war. He was a known actor at the Ford's Theater. Lincoln and his wife went to go see a show, and while watching the show, John Wilkes Booth snuck in. People knew him. They allowed him in. There's no Secret Service back then. He got up behind Lincoln, shot him in the back of the head. He jumped down off this ledge right here. Actually, this is where Lincoln was sitting. He jumped off down the ledge onto the stage, kind of breaks his ankle a little bit, and he gets away because people actually kind of thought it was part of the show because they also knew that he was an actor. So unfortunately, Lincoln does live for a little while, although he's got a bullet in his brain, but he doesn't make it too much longer. He does die hours later, and our first president was assassinated. And we'll have to talk next time about Andrew Johnson and his presidency. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for this. I hope this was informational. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you liked it, give it a like or subscribe. Other than that, peace out, Cub Scouts.